Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we're talking about the Jacksonian Democratic Party, and we have again with us Dr. Sean Beienberg. Dr. Beienberg, we talk about Jacksonian Democrats. How did the Democratic Party emerge in the 1820s?
Right. So again, this is one of the things that we talked about earlier, the sort of fluidity of parties. The Democratic Party, as it's organizing in the 1820s, is, I think, fair to say, the first real political organized party in America. And it organizes largely along the reasoning of the Jeffersonian Democratic Party. In fact, folks like Van Buren will point back to those as their heroes. So as the Federalist Party declines, becomes basically a regional party in New England. People overstate it and think that it dies a little earlier than it does, but it's clearly on its way out. And part of that is that many of the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party end up adopting some of the moderate parts of the Federalist platform. So a great example of that. James Madison, as president, endorses a Bank of the United States because he says, I don't agree with Hamilton's loose interpretation of necessary and proper, but we can empirically prove that a Bank of the United States is in fact necessary and proper to our ability to wage a war and do various things. He says, why? Because we didn't have it and we started to lose the war of 8. Like, it's empirically clear that we need this to execute some of these powers. And so what ends up happening is effectively the Federalist Party collapses. Again, some of its more moderate folks like John Quincy Adams switches into the Jefferson Democratic Republicans. So they call this the era of good feelings in the sense that everybody's supposed to be part of the same party. But what ends up happening is that you create multiple factions within the old Democratic Republican Party. And so one of the factions is called the National Republicans. And this is mostly associated with Henry Clay and John Calhoun and Daniel Webster, who, previewing later, will end up some of them being leaders of the Whigs. And so they basically are willing to have they're willing to have a Bank of the United States. They are willing to, at some level, support some level of infrastructure. Here, there's a little bit of a difference between, say, Clay, on the one hand, who says, I'm a Jeffersonian. I reject Hamilton's idea that we can tax and spend for whatever we want. But he thinks, for example, it's fine to build infrastructure, to spend on infrastructure because of the power for commerce, for roads and postal roads, right? So he says, even using Jefferson's framework, we just don't interpret it quite as strictly. But the basic idea that we can tax and spend for enumerated power means we can do infrastructure. And so he's trying to split the difference. Calhoun and Monroe, amusingly, who had been one of the earliest hardliners, end up adopting almost exactly Hamilton's take on this. And so what happens is, as it looks like the Republican Party or coalition or faction or whatever it is looking more and more like the old Federalists, the more sort of old hardline Jeffersonians decide they need to organize again in a way to basically enforce what their perspective is limited federal power. And so particularly after the 1824 election, where Adams and Clay effectively, they create this like corrupt, everybody calls it a corrupt bargain, but it's actually quite natural that the two candidates with the closest ideological views would work together. I mean, this is fairly like obvious what you would do. But Jackson creates this big burning conspiracy theory about it. And some of his folks, particularly Martin Van Buren, realize that Jackson can be an avenue toward advancing. Jackson is not, he's a general. He's not a political sophisticate or anything like that. Not to say that there have been generals in our U.S. history that are very constitutionally savvy. Jackson is supposedly like barely literate, right? So he's not a deep constitutional thinker. But some of the folks who are realize that he can be basically a vehicle toward pushing back against what they see as effectively the Federalist Party having now captured the old Jeffersonian Party. And so they organize effectively, and Van Buren's really the one who is the impressive sort of maestro about this. But they organize with a lot of the modern architecture that we would think of as a party, basically a group that is designed to ensure that the Constitution is read strictly and faithfully, that we're not going to do the Bank of the United States, or at least certain kinds of it. We're not going to spend on infrastructure loosely. So, and there's some of these folks are actually, one thing that I think is quite interesting. Again, Jackson is not the intellectual brains of this operation. It's Van Buren, or it's one who I think is really interesting, Edward Livingston. Tocqueville, if you read Democracy in America, complains bitterly that Jackson's basically a violent hick. He's just brims with contempt for him, not his Democracy in America, but his travel journals. But he's really impressed by a guy named Edward Livingston, who is he's one of Jackson's cabinet members, but before that, he's one of Jackson's allies in the Senate. And when he was a young man, he was a Jeffersonian congressman. So, but Tocqueville's very impressed by him and his constitutional thinking, his care for federalism, even as he thinks Jackson is basically a violent hick. But that's effectively what the Democratic Party is organized for. The idea is that the federal government is now exceeding its powers. It's doing things that it shouldn't do. And so therefore we need to basically organize, which the Jeffersonians had tried to do with the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, right? Those were originally sort of messages sent from state to state saying, we got to organize. And so Van Buren is trying to make that not just a random memo sent up here and there, but an organized, consistent group of people who are protecting America in their perspective from an aristocratic cabal that doesn't care about the Constitution. So that's sort of how they get built. Again, the Democrats, they don't necessarily have, at least at this point, party line on slavery, right? That will come later, and we'll talk more about that. But they're basically organized around, broadly speaking, a more limited construction of federal power than the National Republicans, and what they see is working with John Marshall on the Supreme Court.
So for this one, I often hear people say, oh, the Jacksonian Democrats, and then are comparing them to modern day Democrats. Thoughts on that?
Yeah,
just
so
because
we have
they have the same name.
Yeah. So the way that you can think of it is, in some ways, the voter base stays somewhat similar. The ideological stuff shifts. We have the narrative, I think, and we'll talk more about this. We talk to Republicans that the parties switch places. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true. But there is basically, I would say, a kind of populist skepticism that gets built that the Jacksonians are weaponizing against, that they're for the sort of the average working man against what they see as sort of the rich, which obviously is a rhetorical tool that is still pretty common among the Democratic Party. The shift largely comes, I would say, with the New Deal, where originally the idea is the federal government is a way for the rich people to enrich themselves. We want a more limited federal government, and just basically under more sort of states' rights, localism, whatever, there will be less tools for the rich to co-opt that. That flips basically between the progressive era and the New Deal. It's easy to overstate this. Again, there's regional stories and things like that. But effectively what I would say is, and we'll talk about this when we look at the Republicans, the Jacksonian ethos, the Republicans later on will be basically a lot of old Jacksonian Democrats themselves. So the Republican Party is effectively half of the Democratic Party from the 1820s. And again, people are shifting in and out coalitionally. So, yeah, I mean, would Andrew Jackson find Franklin Roosevelt utterly, completely appalling based on his constitutional views? Yes, he would, right? Jackson's constitutional views are strict states' rights, et cetera, whereas Roosevelt, as we'll talk about, is much more capacious, even more so than Hamilton. So, but there's some ways that depending on what you want to emphasize, you can see continuities, but I do think it's fair to say that the Jacksonian Democratic Party basically dies in the 1930s. And that's when you see a lot of folks like Al Smith, et cetera, will either quietly endorse the Republicans or in some cases even realign entirely. So the New Deal really is when all this party stuff gets shifted quite strikingly.
Dr. Beienberg, thank you. I think that, we've talked about the Jacksonian Democratic Party. We talked about the Jeffersonian Democratic Party, and this whole series is really kind of diving into looking at party development throughout American history. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.